My son raised his glass at my 86th birthday dinner and called me the old lady who refuses to let go of his father's company, and the strangest thing was that no one at the table seemed surprised. I remember the exact moment because the restaurant suddenly felt very quiet. The kind of quiet that settles over a room when people are pretending not to notice something uncomfortable. The dinner was held at Harborview Grill, a place overlooking the marina where the boats sway gently against their docks. My granddaughter Emma had insisted on reserving the private room weeks earlier. She said turning 86 deserved something special. The table was long enough for 10 people, covered with crisp white linen and small glass candles that flickered softly in the dim light. Outside the wide windows, the evening sun was dropping slowly behind the water, painting everything gold. For a brief moment before Daniel stood up, it had almost felt like a celebration. I had spent the afternoon getting ready with the careful patience that comes with age. I chose a navy blue dress that my late husband Thomas always said made me look dignified. My silver hair was brushed neatly back, and I even wore the pearl necklace he gave me on our 40th anniversary. 86 years is a long time to live, long enough to see families grow and change, and sometimes grow distant in ways you never expect. But that night, I believe my family had gathered to honor the years I had left. Daniel had already finished 2 glasses of bourbon when the waiter brought out the main course. He laughed louder than usual, his words beginning to stretch and slur around the edges. I noticed Laura, his wife, watching him carefully with that tight, polite smile she wore whenever she wanted to pretend everything was perfectly fine. Emma sat beside me, occasionally reaching over to squeeze my hand under the table. She had always been a perceptive girl, the kind who notices things adults think children miss. Halfway through dinner, Daniel pushed his chair back and stood up with his drink in his hand. The legs scraped across the hardwood floor, louder than they should have been. He lifted his glass toward the center of the table, swaying just slightly as he spoke. To the old lady who still won't let go of Dad's company. For a moment no one moved. Someone coughed softly. The waiter paused beside the door, as if unsure whether to step inside or leave us alone. I looked around the table and saw the reactions that told me more than the words themselves. Laura stared down at her plate, hiding a faint smile behind her napkin. One of Daniel's business friends shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Emma turned pale beside me, her fingers tightening around mine. I did the only thing that made sense. I smiled. Not because the words didn't sting, but because by the time you reach 86 you understand something younger people often forget. The loudest insults usually reveal more about the speaker than the person they are meant to embarrass. Daniel lowered his glass and laughed, clearly pleased with himself, as if he had just delivered a clever joke. The candles flickered gently across the table, while outside the last light of sunset faded across the marina. And as I watched my son sit back down in his chair, still chuckling under his breath, I realized something important. That toast had not been a drunken accident. It had been the beginning of something he had been planning for a very long time. I did not respond to my son that night. At 86 years old, I had learned that silence often carries more weight than any argument ever could. The dinner continued as if nothing unusual had happened, which in many ways made the moment feel even colder. Plates were cleared. A new bottle of wine appeared at the center of the table. Someone made a polite comment about the salmon being excellent. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. I could feel it in the way people avoided looking directly at me. Daniel leaned back in his chair with the loose confidence of someone who believed he had just said what everyone else had been thinking for years. His cheeks were slightly flushed from the bourbon, and every now and then he chuckled quietly, as if replaying his own words in his mind. Laura finally spoke after a long moment, her voice light and carefully neutral. She said Daniel had only meant it as a joke, and that everyone knew how stubborn I could be about business matters. She laughed softly while saying it, but the laughter did not reach her eyes. Emma, however, did not laugh at all. She sat beside me very still, her shoulders tight, watching the table with the kind of serious attention that only someone who truly cares will show. When the waiter brought out the birthday cake a few minutes later, the candles were already lit, their small flames flickering against the glass walls of the private room. Someone began to sing the familiar birthday song, but the voices sounded thin and uneven, as if each person were unsure how loudly they should participate. I looked around the table again while they sang, Daniel tapping his glass with one finger. Laura adjusting the bracelet on her wrist. Two of Daniel's colleagues whispering quietly to each other. Emma watching me carefully, as if waiting to see whether I would be hurt. And that was when a strange calm settled over me. I blew out the candles slowly, the smoke rising in thin gray curls above the cake. Everyone applauded politely. Daniel raised his glass again and took another long drink. It was only after the plates were cleared and the evening began winding down that the deeper meaning of his words began to settle into place in my mind. My son had not simply embarrassed me at dinner. He had revealed something he believed with complete certainty. In Daniel's mind, the company that Thomas built no longer belonged to the past. It belonged to the future he imagined for himself. For nearly 50 years, Collins Marine Equipment had been a quiet part of our family's life. Thomas started the company in a small warehouse near the harbor when Daniel was still in elementary school. Back then, our weekends often smelled like engine oil and fresh paint because Thomas was always repairing something for the business. I remember Daniel as a boy sitting on an overturned crate in that warehouse, watching his father work while asking endless questions about boats and machinery. Thomas used to smile whenever Daniel did that. He would say that one day the company might belong to the boy if he was patient enough to learn how it worked. But patience had never been Daniel's strongest quality. As the evening ended and we walked out of the restaurant into the cool coastal air, I realized something that made the entire dinner feel different in hindsight. Daniel had not raised that glass because he was drunk. He had raised it because he believed the time had finally come for me to step aside. The next morning the house felt unusually quiet. I woke before sunrise the way I often do now, long before the rest of the neighborhood stirred. The ocean breeze drifted faintly through the kitchen window, carrying the familiar smell of salt and damp wood from the docks nearby. For more than 30 years this house had been our home, and the mornings here always reminded me of Thomas. He used to wake early as well, pouring his coffee while reviewing invoices from the company before heading down to the harbor warehouse. I moved slowly through my usual routine that morning, measuring coffee grounds carefully and watching the steam rise from the mug as the first pale light appeared outside. What Daniel had said the night before continued to echo quietly in my mind. Not loudly, not angrily, just present, like a clock ticking in the background of a quiet room. When people reach my age, they begin to notice patterns more clearly. Words rarely appear out of nowhere. They grow slowly from thoughts that have been forming for years. As I sat at the small wooden table beside the window, I began remembering small moments that once seemed harmless, but now felt different when viewed together. Over the past year, Daniel had started visiting the office more frequently. At first, he said he simply wanted to help organize things for me since running a business at 86 could be exhausting. I appreciated the gesture at the time. He reviewed shipping reports, asked about supplier contracts, and occasionally suggested that certain decisions might be easier if someone younger handled them. I remember one afternoon when he mentioned that many companies transition leadership to the next generation long before retirement age. He said it casually while leaning against the filing cabinet in my office, flipping through a binder of company records. I simply nodded and reminded him that Collins Marine Equipment had always operated at a steady pace. We had never rushed decisions. That was something Thomas believed strongly. Daniel smiled politely that day, but there was a flicker of impatience behind his expression that I did not fully understand until now. A few months later, Laura began bringing up the subject of retirement homes during family dinners. She said she had seen beautiful communities along the coast with ocean views, private walking paths, and on-site medical staff. She described them in great detail, emphasizing how relaxing it would be for someone my age to live somewhere with fewer responsibilities. I remember thanking her for the suggestion while gently explaining that I still enjoyed managing the company. Running the business had never felt like a burden to me. It was simply part of life, much like tending a garden or keeping a home in order. Emma noticed those conversations as well. She once asked me quietly whether her parents had been discussing the company when I was not around. I told her families often talk about practical matters and that there was no reason to worry. But now, sitting alone with my coffee as the morning sun began warming the wooden floor beneath my feet, I realized that those conversations had never been random. Daniel had been preparing the ground slowly, planting the idea that I was too old to continue doing what I had done for decades. Last night, he had simply said the quiet part out loud. I finished my coffee and stood by the window watching a fishing boat move slowly across the harbor. The water was calm, the engine humming softly in the distance. In that peaceful moment, I understood something with complete clarity. My son believed that time itself would eventually force me to surrender the company his father built. What he did not understand, yet, was that Thomas had always planned much further ahead than anyone realized. Thomas used to say that running a company was not very different from steering a boat through shallow water. If you rush forward without understanding the tides beneath you, you will eventually run aground. That morning his words returned to me more clearly than they had in years. After finishing my coffee, I walked slowly down the hallway toward the small study at the back of the house. The room had not changed much since the day Thomas passed away 7 years ago. His desk still faced the same window overlooking the harbor road. The leather chair remained slightly worn where he used to sit late into the evening reviewing ledgers and shipment orders. I opened the drawer on the right side of the desk and removed a small wooden box that had rested there untouched for a long time. Inside were several documents Thomas asked me to keep safe. At the time, I did not fully understand why he insisted on organizing everything so carefully. Thomas had always been methodical, but during the final years of his life, he became even more attentive to details concerning the company. I remember one quiet Sunday afternoon when he sat beside me at this same desk explaining that businesses, like families, often face unexpected storms. He said that love between relatives does not always guarantee good decisions when money and control become involved. I laughed gently at the time because the idea seemed unnecessary. Our family had never argued about such things. Daniel was busy building his own career, Emma was still finishing college, and the company itself operated smoothly with a loyal group of employees who had been with us for decades. Thomas only smiled and placed his hand over mine. He told me that preparation was not about expecting the worst from people you care about. It was about protecting the work of a lifetime so that emotions could not easily dismantle it. As I opened the wooden box that morning, I saw the familiar envelope labeled in Thomas's precise handwriting. Inside were copies of the trust documents he finalized several years before his passing. At the time, our attorney explained that the arrangement ensured stability for the company if anything unexpected happened. I had not studied the paperwork closely since then because there was never any urgent reason to do so. The business continued operating exactly as it always had. Our shipping contracts remained steady, our employees dependable, and the harbor warehouse still opened its doors at 7 o'clock every morning just as Thomas liked it. But now, with Daniel's words from the previous night still echoing quietly in my thoughts, the documents in my hands carried a different weight. I sat down in Thomas's chair and carefully read through the pages again, paying attention to the details I once trusted others to remember for me. Outside the window, the morning traffic along Harbor Road began to increase as delivery trucks moved toward the Marina District. The familiar rhythm of the town carried on as usual, unaware of the quiet shift happening inside this small study. By the time I finished reading the final page, I understood something Daniel had not considered. Thomas did not simply build a company with hard work and patience. He also built safeguards that ensured the future of Collins Marine Equipment would not depend on anyone's impatience, not even our own sons. I remained seated at Thomas's desk for a long time after finishing the documents, listening to the quiet sounds of the harbor town waking up outside. A delivery truck rolled past the house, its engine humming steadily as it headed toward the marina. Somewhere down the street, a neighbor started a lawnmower. The ordinary rhythm of the morning felt almost comforting, as if the world itself was reminding me that steady things tend to outlast sudden impatience. I placed the papers back inside the envelope and returned them to the wooden box, but the clarity they brought stayed with me. Thomas had never believed in leaving important matters to chance. Years earlier, he worked closely with our attorney, Michael Harper, to create a legal structure around the company that was far more thoughtful than Daniel seemed to understand. At the time, Thomas explained that businesses often fail not because of outside competition, but because families rush decisions after a founder is gone. I remember teasing him that he was planning for problems that would never happen to us. He simply smiled the way he often did when he believed patience would eventually prove his point. Later that morning, I decided it was time to speak with Michael Harper again. His office was only 15 minutes away by car, located in a quiet brick building near the courthouse downtown. I called his number just after 9 o'clock, expecting to leave a message, but he answered on the second ring. His voice sounded exactly as I remembered, calm and measured. When I told him who I was, there was a brief pause before he greeted me warmly and asked how I had been doing. I explained that I had recently reviewed some of the documents Thomas prepared years ago and that I would appreciate meeting in person to discuss them. Michael did not ask many questions over the phone. Attorneys who have practiced for as long as he has tend to understand when details are better discussed privately. He simply said that his schedule was open later that afternoon and that he would be glad to see me. The drive into town felt familiar and peaceful. The coastal highway curved gently along the water, and the marina was already busy with fishermen preparing their boats for the day. I parked beside the courthouse square and walked slowly toward the office building, noticing how many storefronts had changed over the years while others remained exactly the same. Inside Michael's office, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. He greeted me with a firm handshake and guided me to a comfortable chair beside his desk. After a few minutes of polite conversation, I placed the envelope containing Thomas's documents in front of him. Michael adjusted his glasses and began reviewing the pages carefully. The room remained quiet while he read, the only sound coming from the soft turning of paper. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me with an expression that was both respectful and serious. He explained that the trust Thomas established was designed specifically to prevent sudden changes in company leadership without careful oversight. In simple terms, the arrangement ensured that no one person could pressure the company into decisions that ignored its long-term stability. As Michael spoke, I realized that Daniel's confidence at the birthday dinner had come from an assumption rather than from knowledge. My son believed control of the company would naturally pass to him simply because time was moving forward. What he did not realize was that Thomas had already prepared for that exact moment years before it arrived. Michael Harper did not rush his explanation. Attorneys who spend decades working with family businesses tend to speak slowly when the truth is complicated. He folded his hands on the desk and looked directly at me before continuing. The trust your husband created is structured so that operational authority remains with you unless specific conditions are met. In simple language, that means no transfer of control can occur just because someone expects it to. I listened carefully while the quiet hum of traffic from the courthouse square drifted through the window behind him. Michael continued reviewing the papers and pointed to several sections Thomas had insisted on including. These clauses required unanimous approval from the trust administrators before any ownership shift could take place. Thomas had appointed 2 administrators in addition to me. One was Michael himself. The other was a longtime accountant named Robert Langley who had handled the company finances for more than 20 years. Neither administrator could approve a change without clear justification that it protected the stability of the company. Michael explained that Thomas designed the arrangement so that decisions would always be measured rather than emotional. Collins Marine Equipment was not simply an asset to divide between relatives. It was a functioning business with employees, contracts, suppliers, and a reputation built carefully over decades. If leadership changed too quickly, the consequences could affect dozens of families who depended on the company for their livelihoods. I understood exactly what Thomas had been protecting. Daniel had always viewed the company as an inheritance waiting to be claimed. Thomas saw it differently. To him, the company was a responsibility that passed only when someone proved they were ready to carry it. Michael finished reviewing the final page and slid the envelope back across the desk toward me. He asked whether something had happened recently that caused me to revisit these documents. I paused for a moment before answering. I described the dinner and Daniel's comment about the company. Michael listened quietly without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded slowly, not with surprise, but with the understanding of someone who had seen similar situations unfold many times before. He said that transitions between generations often become complicated when expectations grow faster than patience. The important thing, he explained, was that the legal structure Thomas built remained fully active. That meant no sudden request or emotional pressure could override the safeguards already in place. As I left the office that afternoon, the sun had moved higher above the courthouse square, and the sidewalks were busy with people going about their ordinary day. I walked slowly toward my car, thinking about how confident Daniel had looked while raising his glass at the dinner table. Confidence can sometimes grow from misunderstanding rather than knowledge. My son believed time alone would eventually hand him the authority he wanted. What he did not yet realize was that Thomas had never trusted time to protect what he built. He trusted preparation instead. The drive back from the courthouse felt slower than usual, though the road and the traffic were exactly the same as they had always been. The afternoon sunlight reflected off the harbor water in long bright streaks that moved gently with the tide. I kept thinking about the quiet certainty in Michael Harper's voice when he explained the structure Thomas had created. Preparation instead of assumption. Stability instead of impatience. Those were always Thomas's priorities. When I reached the house, I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment before turning off the engine. The old maple tree in the front yard rustled softly in the breeze, its branches casting shifting shadows across the porch steps. For years that porch had been the place where Daniel played as a boy, while Thomas repaired fishing engines in the garage. I could still picture him at 8 years old riding his bicycle in slow circles on the driveway, asking endless questions about how boats worked and why propellers spun the way they did. Back then he wanted to understand everything his father did. Somewhere along the way, curiosity turned into expectation. Inside the house, the afternoon felt peaceful. The kitchen clock ticked steadily on the wall while a faint scent of the coffee I made earlier still lingered in the air. I placed the envelope containing the trust documents back inside the wooden box in Thomas's study. Closing the drawer felt almost ceremonial, as if I were quietly returning something important to its proper place. Daniel had always believed the company would eventually become his simply because he was the only son. Thomas never said otherwise directly. He preferred to observe how people handled responsibility before deciding how much of it they should carry. Collins Marine Equipment had grown slowly over 4 decades because Thomas refused to rush decisions that could affect other people's livelihoods. The warehouse near the harbor now employed more than 30 workers who depended on the steady flow of marine repair contracts and equipment shipments. Many of them had worked with Thomas since the early years when the business operated out of a single rented building. To them, the company was not just an inheritance waiting for a new owner. It was their daily work, their mortgages, their children's school tuition. I realized then that the toast Daniel made at the birthday dinner revealed more than impatience. It revealed how differently he saw the company compared with the way his father built it. For Daniel, the business represented opportunity. For Thomas, it represented responsibility. That difference mattered more than Daniel seemed to understand. Later that evening, my phone rang while I was preparing a simple dinner in the kitchen. The screen displayed Daniel's name. His voice sounded unusually friendly when I answered. He asked how I was feeling after the birthday celebration and whether I had given any thought to the conversation about the company. The question was casual, almost rehearsed, as if he expected a particular answer. I stirred the soup slowly while listening to him speak. Outside the kitchen window, the harbor lights were beginning to glow across the water as evening settled over the town. I replied calmly that I had indeed been thinking about the company and that it was always wise to review important matters carefully. Daniel sounded pleased by that response. What he did not realize during that conversation was that I had already taken the first quiet step toward understanding exactly how Thomas intended the future of Collins Marine Equipment to unfold. I slept well that night, which surprised me. At my age, sleep often arrives lightly, like a guest who never plans to stay very long. But that evening my mind felt unusually clear. Perhaps it was the quiet certainty that comes from understanding something important at the right moment. When the morning sun filtered through the kitchen curtains the next day, I followed the same routine I had kept for years. Coffee first, then a slow walk across the backyard garden where Thomas once planted rows of tomatoes every spring. The air smelled fresh from the ocean breeze drifting inland, and the gulls were already circling above the marina. Routine has a way of grounding a person when life begins shifting beneath the surface. After breakfast, I drove down to the harbor warehouse for the first time in several weeks. The building stood exactly where it always had, a long weathered structure with large sliding doors that opened toward the docks. Collins Marine Equipment had grown over the decades, but the original warehouse remained the heart of the operation. When I stepped inside, the familiar scent of engine oil, wood, and sea air greeted me like an old friend. A few employees looked up from their work and smiled warmly. Most of them had known me for years. Robert Langley, the company accountant, and the other administrator Thomas trusted, was already inside the small office near the loading area reviewing invoices. Robert had been with the company since Daniel was still in high school. He greeted me with the steady calm that defined his personality and asked how The birthday celebration had gone. I told him it had been memorable in ways I had not expected. We sat down at the desk and began reviewing the current financial reports. The numbers were stable, just as they had been for years. Contracts from 3 regional marinas continued to bring steady revenue, and the maintenance division remained fully booked for the next several months. Stability had always been the company's strength. While we talked, I mentioned that I had recently reviewed the trust documents Thomas created before his passing. Robert nodded slowly, as if he had been waiting for that subject to appear one day. He explained that Thomas spoke with him several times during those final years about the importance of protecting the company from sudden leadership changes driven by impatience. Thomas believed the business should only pass to someone who demonstrated a genuine understanding of the work and the people behind it. Robert also reminded me that the trust required agreement between the administrators before any major structural change could take place. That safeguard existed for a reason. As we finished reviewing the reports, I realized that Daniel's confidence rested on an assumption he had never truly examined. He believed the future would eventually move in his favor simply because time was passing. What he did not realize was that the foundation of the company had been carefully reinforced long before he began imagining himself in control. When I left the warehouse later that afternoon, the harbor looked peaceful beneath the pale blue sky. Boats rocked gently against their moorings, and the tide moved slowly through the channel. Standing there for a moment, I understood something with complete clarity. Daniel believed he had started a conversation about the future of the company. In reality, the future had already been quietly prepared years before he decided to claim it. The following week passed quietly, though the calm carried a new sense of awareness that had not been there before. Each morning, I followed my familiar routine, while the harbor town moved through its ordinary rhythm. The fishing boats left before sunrise, delivery trucks arrived at the warehouse shortly after 7 o'clock, and the employees of Collins Marine Equipment continued their work the same way they had for years. Stability has a way of revealing the truth about impatience. Businesses that grow slowly often survive longer than the ambitions of people who believe success should arrive quickly. 2 evenings after my visit to the warehouse, Daniel called again. His tone carried the same careful friendliness he used during the previous conversation, the kind of politeness people adopt when they believe an important agreement is close. He asked whether I had thought further about the future of the company. I could almost imagine him standing in his kitchen while speaking, leaning against the counter with the quiet confidence that the conversation would eventually move in his direction. I told him that I had indeed been thinking about the company, and that important decisions deserve patience. There was a pause on the line before he replied. Daniel said that patience was exactly why he wanted to discuss the transition soon. He explained that modern businesses needed younger leadership, and that he was ready to step in whenever I felt comfortable letting go of daily responsibilities. His voice sounded calm, but beneath that calm I heard the same expectation that had been present during the birthday dinner. For Daniel, the future had already been decided in his mind. What remained, he believed, was simply the moment when I acknowledged it. I listened quietly while he spoke, remembering something Thomas once told me during the early years of the company. He said that when someone is certain they deserve control, they often stop asking the most important question of all. Are they prepared to carry the responsibility that comes with it? Collins Marine Equipment had survived recessions, supply shortages, and storms that closed the harbor for days at a time. It survived because decisions were made carefully, with patience and respect for the people whose lives depended on the company remaining steady. When Daniel finished explaining his thoughts, I thanked him for caring about the future of the business. Then I told him something simple. I said that the structure his father created ensured that any decision about leadership would be made thoughtfully and with proper guidance from the administrators Thomas trusted. Daniel did not respond immediately. The silence on the phone lasted only a few seconds, but it carried the weight of someone realizing that the path ahead might not be as straightforward as he once believed. After we ended the call, I stepped outside onto the porch and watched the harbor lights shimmer across the dark water. The night air felt calm and steady, just like the town itself. Daniel believed he had begun a conversation about taking control of the company his father built. What he did not yet understand was that the true conversation about the future had started long before that birthday dinner, quietly written into the plans Thomas prepared years ago.